Okay, well, welcome, folks. It is 6 o'clock on the west coast of Canada. Welcome to the September edition of the Vancouver Power BI and Modern Excel User Group Meetup Power BI track. We are going to get kicked off and going here. So the first thing I need to do is actually click on my slides so I can advance them and get this thing going. So we are now into our welcome and overview section. I'm going to do just a brief little couple of different things here going in, and then we're going to kick it over to Yana at approximately 6:05 for this month's edition of What's New in Power BI, and around 7:20, actually, hang on a second, 7:20 p.m. for the feature presentation. We'll get Peter started a little earlier than that. We won't make Yana present for an hour and a bit. So at 6:20, we should be good to go, and then we should wrap up, I don't know, an hour-ish, depending on what Peter actually needs for his time. I think we got our stuff a little bit messed up there, but that's all good. We'll make it happen. I want to throw out a big thanks to the sponsors here for tonight that make sure that these events actually end up happening. Excel Guru is my company that puts these things together and gets the speakers all organized and actually shows up and hosts and MCs on the given day. SkillWave is our training division at skillwave.training, where we have all kinds of awesome and amazing Power Query, Power Pivot, Power BI, DAX training, all kinds of good stuff there. So if you are in the market for learning some great stuff, you definitely want to check that out. Microsoft, as always, that helps us out with the software, provides our feature speaker for our What's New today as well in Yana, which is awesome. And I also want to throw out a quick acknowledgement to one of the products that I build, which is called Monkey Tools. This is an add-in for Excel that allows you to help build better models faster when you're working with Power Query and Power Pivot. And just as a fun little aside on this, our feature speaker in Peter is actually one of the people that convinced me to actually get this add-in out and into marketplace. We were sitting at an MVP summit one day, and Peter was asking me why he didn't have a monkey on his ribbon in Excel. I'm not sure if he does, because I don't know if he's actually installed my software, but he now has the ability to do that at any rate. So there you go, just a fun little aside on this one as well. The next meetups we have that are coming up, these are open for RSVPs now. On Thursday, October 7th, I'm super excited to be welcoming my friend Michael Olafusi, whose name I have probably not pronounced correctly, to be coming and doing our Excel track. He's going to be speaking on using Excel for your personal finance, and this is going to be the first time that Michael's going to be joining us, so that's going to be pretty cool. Also, I will be leading the Power BI track next month, and the focus that we're going to be looking at is we're going to talk about queries versus parameters. What's the difference between the two of these when you're working in Power Query? Are there scenarios where you should be using scalar queries for single values instead of using parameters, or vice versa? And that's going to be the focus of the talk next month. Both of these, as I say, are open for RSVPs. I also want to throw a quick note out that right now we have my self-service BI bootcamp is actually on special at SkillWave. It's $200 off to get into this. There is a huge amount of training goes into this, about 33 hours of training and coaching, plus ongoing Q&A and AMA sessions for an entire year where you can actually get a lot of your questions answered and whatnot. Free copy of my book and all kinds of extra good stuff there. If you are interested in signing up for this, we will be kicking off on October 12th is when the semester actually starts. So there's still a little bit of time to convince your boss that you really need to attend to this. We're really looking forward to it. It's got great reviews here, and I can't wait to get started on the next semester and show some more people all about how to work with it. Work with Excel and Power BI, lots of Power Query, Power Pivot, DAX, all kinds of good stuff in there. If you're not aware, my new book, Master Your Data for Excel and Power BI, is finally out after many, many years of delay. It is now available for sale via SkillWave in PDF format. It is also available in physical copy through the Mr. Excel shop as well. If you are in the US, you can actually get it shipped to you now, and it will be coming to more locations soon. November 1st, it will start shipping through Amazon and also the IPG bookstore, which you can actually find through Mr. Excel, that is international. So we're getting closer. I am so excited to be able to get my hands on a copy of this because I haven't even got my copy yet. So I'm really looking forward to when that actually shows up. The last thing I want to throw out there is if you are interested in speaking at the VanPug user group on either Excel or Power BI or a mixture of the both, we would love to have you here. We do have slots available, and we're going to be starting to try and fill out our next year's speaker slots very, very soon here. If you want to try your hand at this, whether you want to do a what's new in Power BI and just take a 15-minute slot at the beginning, or whether you want to do a full session on something, we would love to have you. Please fill out the survey here. Let us know. We'll get in contact, and you know, we take it from there. Now, on that note, hey, I got to 6:05 p.m. exactly, which is what I actually promised on it. So now I get to turn it over to Yana, who is standing in for Joseph once again. Yana, welcome back to the user group. It is your turn. I'm going to let you take over the screen. And how much stuff do you have for us today?
Not a lot, like just a little bit. So it's going to be okay, hopefully.
That makes it a little easier to get through it all then.
Yes, you can see my screen, I suppose?
I can see it perfectly, you bet.
Okay, perfect. Then it's a good thing. So, hi there. This is what's new and exciting with Power BI. Well, where I will try to summarize in 50 minutes whatever happened in the last month. That was extremely productive month for the Power BI team. So, good luck to all of us. So, first of all, I am Yana Berkovich. I'm a PM for instructor-led training at Microsoft, and I'm former data platform MVP. And I was in Vancouver, and now I'm here in Seattle. But I still work on Power Platform and mostly on Power BI, which is amazing. You can follow me on Twitter or on LinkedIn. What is instructor-led training? This is a series of courses that we release content for, and many partners, including some that might be present here, are training this content. You can also download and train this content if you are a partner, if you are a trainer, MCP, or even if you are a client and you would like to pick them up. Content is open to be downloaded and trained. The news for this month are, first of all, this Power Platform ILT. So we have a new welcome page for the training that is not Power BI. There is the RPA, robotic process automation in a day, for example, and virtual agent in a day, and so on. Go in, fill a quick survey in order if you are a trainer that would like to train on those subjects, or look up for in our partners page, which are the partners that are delivering and where is the session near you. Well, it's probably going to be online because we're encouraging online events only, and due to the whatever Peter was telling you before, due to the pandemic, of course. So I would love to see more of you participating or training the training content that we are providing. All the links are right here. So this is the new one, Power Platform ILT. First of all, first, it's that time of the year again. We have got a new data gateway update. So I would like to encourage all of you to go to the special place in our Power BI service and go ahead and download the data gateway. Just reminding for those of you who are not, or who are usually not downloading it, that this is important and should be done. So, oops, and this is the wrong presentation. Give me a second. Oh my God, this is not counting towards my time. That's not fair. Okay, so please download the data gateway. Next thing. We have one of our intern that his name is Eitan Nets, and he's the son of Amir Nets from the Power BI team. He has created new ways to visualize, more fun ways to visualize with Power BI. So we have got the icons and the buttons in many shapes, and we can even create an icon. So here you can see how I have created an icon from the picture of my cat Felix. So how do you do that in Power BI? Because of course, I'm not going to choose something as boring as an email icon or something like this. It's of course going to be my cat that is going to be the icon. So how are we doing this? We are going right here. We are going into buttons, and we are going, for example, for the blank back button. It used to be just this square boring shape that you can, of course, play with. But now you can have here an icon. It can be a custom icon, and then you can upload any type of image. Felix the cat was the one that's chosen for this one. And of course, and additionally, you can also have a different shape for it. So the shape is now a rectangle for this item that I have just, for this button that I have just built. But as you can see, I can have a heart shape, which is on the left, or I can have, for example, different shape that I am choosing. And this is going to become the shape eventually. What happened here? Okay. I need to have all the ages and other things in there. So not sure what happened here exactly, but this is the final result. It can have a different type of shapes. What happened to the arrow? No idea. Okay, there we go. So this is how you play around with it. You can also play with the edges, the shapes, sizes, and of course the different colors, but not just the more custom colors. This was introduced, I think, 2 or 3 months ago. Not just the colors themselves, but also the colors of the shades. So now you can have so many different types of 3D art around it. You can basically create from Power BI used to be called PowerPoint for data, so now you can actually act with it just like PowerPoint and enjoy all the wonderful and different creations that this new feature allows you. So please play with it, but be careful. And remember, we have a lot of rules around data visualization. So if it is not some kind of a report for fun that you can add to your data gallery, but a report for your workplace, maybe should some aesthetic rules should be followed in order for the Power BI to look, report to look good. Additional things that we have done that were added this month for the visualizations was 2 visualizations updated. So this is the line chart, and this is based on the data set that we are using in advanced data visualization. And as you can see now, the line chart finally has a category. You see here is urban, here is accessory, the category is written, and you don't have to have the category written right here in the right here as the tooltip, or right here as the no, sorry about that. I forgot as the category, but it is a part of the line. So a very useful feature that can be configured inside of this series label, inside of this series label on and off. Another thing is about the waterfall. That was something that was also came out of the feedback. The waterfall now can have a summarized data for each type of the category, for each type of the summarizations, and you can see the totals, which was also something that was requested. And in here you can also understand how you can also define how many levels are going to be broken into. So for example, here I can have more levels and increase the number that I'm breaking down to if I add more categories and so on. So play around with it. It's extremely useful and extremely fun. One more button here that I don't know if you had the chance to try or no. This is the paginated report preview. So paginated report is not the same designer. This is the separate tool that is part of the Power BI. And now you can, through this button, connect your paginated report, to connect to a specific paginated report, and you can see the changes reflected in both reports and not just in this report. More about paginated reports later when we are going back to our slides. So another one is Power Automate preview. So now the Power Automate connector in Power BI is no longer a preview, is general availability. So when you do the data connector here and add this Power Automate feature into Power BI, and you Power Automate visual into Power BI, you can add Power BI functionality into your process flow. Another thing that we'll discuss in a few seconds. I have a whole presentation about Power Automate and Power BI better together, and so are many other MVPs right now that are presenting in different conferences. So I am encouraging you now that it's, especially now that it's general availability, to see how useful it is and how you can combine Power Automate and Power BI to go and work together. It's a general availability starting this month. And back to the hopefully right presentation this time. Just a second. Okay, so we reviewed the different shapes that can be created with the button and the additional options. We have reviewed the out-of-the-box visual updates, the line chart series label, that now you don't have to have the legend. Hallelujah, remember the board. You don't have to have the legend for line series. You can have the names when it is comfortable on the series itself, and the toggle total column for the waterfall chart. Sensitivity labels, another thing that is very unique. Sensitivity labels are not just can be exported to Excel. Now they can can be exported into the Power BI templates that you are creating. You can basically export them to the Power BI template, and it is one more step that is added to your Power BI report. So Power BI will probably tell you, hey, you need to add sensitivity label before you publish something or before you save something. And it is also can be defined into your group policy inside your administrative access for your organization. Additionally, you can then search for those specific sensitivity labels in your Activity Explorer. So read more about it and use more your sensitivity labels. I will show you where to add them if I have time at the end to go to the report again. And we have on the service level, we have the premium per user workspace. Premium per user workspace was introduced a few months ago, and it of course is cheaper for those of you who don't want to buy the corporate premium service. And one of the things that it enables, and now is part of it, is the quick insights that before was only part of the premium. We have explored some of it, I think, in the previous New and Exciting about what quick insights can do. Just in a glance to give you one little glance of it. So insights can be found in here. Insights, when you publish in the report, you can get insights right here inside your my workspace. You don't even need to get to your organizational workspace. For this one, it is just the count insights, but it just had before. No, come on, I have prepared before. So it had many, oh, there we go. So there are many insights that are related to this specific report that can be found when you click on Get Insights. You can pin any type of visualization if you would like to later on and continue working with that. So this is another feature that now is more available than it used to be before. Advanced data modeling. So in data modeling, the function calculate and calculate table gets a new feature. It supports a aggregation function, as you can see here. So if you want to learn more, you can go, of course, to study with Lauren on self-paced, or of course, there is the data modeling instructor-led training, data modeling and data shaping that will help you out with introduction to DAX and what into introduction to the data modeling and the DAX function calculate and calculate table. Another thing that was added in data modeling is to format based on user locales. It is US against the world. So if you are formatting in US or in Netherlands or in Israel time frame or in any other way that people are framing the time in they have some kind of a locale, you can get the same date in a different ways, which is extremely useful for those of us who are working on for different places, and is very helpful to see our data in the locale that we are sharing. Next is Microsoft Power Automate connector is general availability. This we have talked about. I've shown you where you can find the Power Automate connector and the Power Automate visual, but I haven't shown you how because it's 15 minutes, I haven't shown you how am I going to create a Power Automate flow using Power BI inside. So this is an example of a Power Automate flow. Power Automate is one of the 4 Power platform tools for those of you who are less familiar with it. And this is the tool that does the process automation. So inside the process automation, you can now add the Power BI actions. You could have done it before, but now all the connectors are general availability, so nothing is in preview. And this is great news for us. And I am looking forward to see you working with this, and maybe some samples and examples in our data storage galleries could be very nice. Paginated report. So paginated report builder was updated. It has a new 64-bit version that you can download. Download link is right here or in your Power BI report. We have got a paginated report training that is actually going to be updated next week. So yet another way to train and to upskill yourself is to go with Learn. That Microsoft Learn has also lots of training around paginated reports. Now, just please remember that paginated report is not the same as Power BI report builder, Power BI report. Those are different types of report. This paginated report is more on-premises and more resembles the way that SSRS used to be. So there we go. There are some accessibility fixes, performance gains, and other cool features that are added. Paginated reports with the visual is usually updated a little later than Power BI. So watch for the new visual abilities as well. Power BI and Excel. It is an Excel user group as well. So we used to have a need for a premium or pro license in order to contact dataset from my workspace in Excel. So not anymore. Now, if you have a my workspace that is open, you can connect without the premium or pro license. Even if you have a Power BI free license, you cannot connect from Excel to a dataset hosted in a Power BI premium workspace. So for example, you have some kind of Excel connected to you from from the premium, but you are not part of this premium. You can access it. Of course, yes, you need some kind of permissions to this specific data set, and you need the right sensitivity defined and so on. So it's not that simple. Of course, the data is protected still, but you can build the Power Pivot tables connected to Power BI dataset and even look up and refresh all the values. So this is the link for the blog post about it. Read it. But at the end of the day, it's not just about your license. It's also about your permissions and about the sensitivity that you can be exposed to according to the policy of the organization. We have talked in June when I was here for the What's New and Exciting 15 minutes about goals. I have told you a lot about goals and how awesome they are, that you can have them now in the premium capacity. Now you can have goals and update goals on the go using the mobile. I have decided not to create a mobile report because they have created a very fancy one right there in the blog. So the mobile app, you can update your goals, you can update the scorecard, you can see different goals, you can see what is exactly going on inside your goals, and of course to track it back to the report. It was not available for mobile before that. And I would like to end with the new playground for devs. The devs have a new playground that you can explore. And I am sure I've opened it. There we go. So going to the link that is mentioned in the blog, you can see the embedded analytics program. So what basically we can do, we can go ahead and try it on the developer sandbox, explore the APIs are used. By the way, there are new APIs that were just out and about, but we are at 6.22. And we can also browse showcase of other developers and what they have done. So on the Power BI playground, I will give the mic back to Peter. Hopefully it was not too fast. And I will answer questions offline in the chat. So thank you.
Thanks, Yana. Appreciate you you coming back and pitching in on this one again. That's fantastic. Ton of stuff to get through for sure. All right, Peter, are you ready to go?
Yeah, I'm just sharing my desktop. So please let me know if you see a title slide.
I can see a title slide.
Awesome.
Yes.
Okay, well, I'm set to go. So I'm putting a stopwatch on, I guess. You're giving me, what, 60 minutes?
I will give you 60-ish minutes, what you actually need, Peter. So you can, if you need 65 or even 80, we're pretty easy.
I could do what Yana does, and that is just speed up what I need to say to make it fit in. But no,
take the time you need, man.
Nah, we're all good. All right, look, thank you very much for having me present to the user group. So welcome to this presentation on the topic that is called demystifying datasets. So, are you confused, confounded, by the enormous array of features, capabilities, frameworks, and terms used by Power BI because, after all, it's a service that's undergone enormous change and growth over the past 5 years. So I was sitting down with a colleague and friend, Chris Webb, who now works for Microsoft, and we came to the conclusion that there was a lot of confusion, and understandably so, that even as experts ourselves, we find ourselves a little unclear on what some of the terms mean. So we put together essentially a presentation like a glossary of terms around datasets. And we hope that it will inspire you to better embrace the remarkable technology that drives Power BI. Because, of course, as a visualization service, it's driven by data. And the quality of your visualizations are almost entirely dependent on the data models that you can publish. All right, so with that introduction, very briefly myself, so Peter Myers, a data platform MVP of 15 years now, based here in Melbourne, Australia. I did turn the camera on somewhat reluctantly, and you'll see that there's a very wild man look going on, and I sort of made this commitment to myself that I will stay wild man until our lockdowns cease. But I didn't realize the lockdowns were going to be continually extended, so please bear with me in this look. I'm also going to mention Chris Webb because Chris was part of the creative power behind this presentation. Chris would ordinarily join me. We have been doing virtual roadshows, but unfortunately it's the middle of the night in London, and so the West Coast North America didn't quite fit with him. All right, it's always my tradition to know a little bit more about who you are. So what I'm going to do is switch to my real-time dashboard. And I'm also going to paste a link into the chat window, and that will allow you to very quickly click on the link. So let me just get that chat window up, and please feel free to submit some responses to the survey questions about who you are, and those results will come up here real time in the Power BI dashboard. Aha, okay, it's working. There's always this nervous pause that something isn't coming together, but thank you, those results are coming in. And what we typically see is the audience that attends this session is either a BI developer or a business analyst, or perhaps a data architect, so no surprises there. The age and gender, not so interested in these details. Sometimes they become relevant, especially if the data set is used in some AI scenario. But from an experience perspective, I can see anywhere from a beginner with a self-rating of 1 right through to what looks like to be a couple of Jedis there, but no, a couple of ninjas, sorry, but no Jedis today. All right, so as those results still come in, what I'll do is click through on the dashboard and switch to what is the important topic for you guys. And actually, not surprising, optimization always seems to be the #1. Fundamentals comes in, and it certainly is a starting place in just a moment to begin with what is a data set and build from there, and model frameworks. So we'll be covering off on most of these. With a 60-minute time constraint, I might need to accelerate or leap over some of the topics, but rest assured that the presentation is available to download. Just stay tuned at the end for the link to download the PDF. And the last thing that I'll mention is that we certainly encourage questions. But please put them in the chat window, and I'll reserve some minutes at the end to go through any final questions. All right, well, thanks for participating in the survey. And let's begin with the agenda, beginning with the obvious place, and that is to discuss the fundamentals themselves. So remember, this presentation is a series of terms, like a glossary of terms. So what we will do, obviously, is begin with the data set itself, which is described then as, the primary artifact in Power BI. All right, it is the source of data, and they're stored within workspaces. So what it means is this, is that within your tenant, you might have, for example, workspace A and a single data set with a couple of reports and a dashboard, but within the same tenant, you've got workspace B, and we see a couple of reports. Now, notice that report B1 can connect and query dataset A1, all right? So the takeaway here is that datasets can be accessed across workspaces, granted that you have the correct permissions in place. Now, Chris will join us in a way today because paginated report bear pops in for a moment and says, hold on a minute, Chris. If you're talking about datasets, what does that mean for paginated reports? Because if you're familiar with paginated reports or SQL Server reporting services, then the term dataset has been used for, let's say, close to 2 decades now. But we want to be clear here that this is a different construct, right? A dataset in a paginated report is a command to retrieve data. And just to make things a little more wobbly, that a paginated report has a data source that could be based on a Power BI dataset, of which you then create a paginated report dataset to query it. All right, moving forward in this presentation, we are not covering datasets or paginated reports, as interesting as those topics are. The next topic then, or term, is the datasets hub. All right, so how do you discover these datasets? And it's a relatively recent concept. In your navigation pane at the left, you can click on datasets and it will present to you a list of all data sets that you have permission to work with. Now, permissions is another topic, but let me just say, if you have build permission enabling you to create reports or other content, then they will list. Or if a dataset owner has granted visibility, then you might see them here as well, although they may be grayed out, indicating that you can discover them, but you can't necessarily create new reports based on them. So the Datasets Hub is an ideal place to go looking for data. The next term, and Chris and I were very strong on this because Chris and I come from the same backgrounds, that we were data modelers, 20 years ago. And the data model is just so intrinsic to everything Power BI does. So by definition, it's a queryable object or resource that is optimized for analytics. And when we talk about Microsoft data models, they can be queried using one of 2 languages, either DAX, data analysis expressions, or MDX, multidimensional expressions. They can also be described as semantic models, or in the context of a data discussion, they're simply called a model. Now, it leads us to the next term because as a queryable resource, that data model is queried in a very special way. The type of query using DAX or MDX is known as an analytic query, and it has 3 distinct phases of filter, group, and summarize. So let's take a look at it by example. Here I have a wealth of data, and it really is just a list of all the company's sales orders, of which there are thousands and thousands, and yet I have this simple question. And that question is, well, what were the quarterly sales in 2021? Now, to find the answer to that question, the data does need to be filtered. It then needs to be grouped, and then it needs to be summarized. All right, so within the context of a Power BI report then, that filter could be implemented perhaps by a page slicer. Here we are filtering the data model by 2021. The grouping and summarization occur within a data visual. In this case, let's select a column chart visual where the grouping are the quarters and the summarization appears as the column heights. So it is fair to say that every visual in Power BI executes analytic queries. All right, it filters, groups, and summarizes your data. Now, that leads us to a very special type of data model known as the tabular data model. And it's one that comprises tables and columns, yet is embellished with other types of objects, including relationships, hierarchies, levels, and calculations. Do note that all models that you develop for Power BI in Power BI Desktop are tabular. So it allows me to introduce quite quickly a mind map of what the Power BI Desktop product does for us. In fact, it is a product that supports 2 different designers. There's data model design and there's report design. With our focus just on data modeling and what we understand to be tabular data modeling, well, the base object are tables, so where do they come from? Power Query as a technology allows you to connect to a vast array of different data stores, and then you can use the formula language of M to describe how to retrieve and transform that data into a table structure. And then when these queries are applied, they result in model tables. So this is the most common way that a table is added to your tabular model. Less common is that you can use data analysis expressions or DAX to add tables to your model, but there's a big difference here. DAX can only be used to create tables that either transform existing data or they can generate series of data, like dates within a time range. Calculated tables cannot connect to external data stores and retrieve data. That is Power Query's job. So with the foundational object of a tabular model being the table, of course, it comprises columns that can also be created with DAX. And where you have one or more tables, you're going to create relationships that support filter propagation. More on that in just a moment. For usability and optionally, you can add hierarchies which have levels for navigating across columns, year, quarter, month, and day. And then for the summarization piece, DAX can be used to add measures, and these achieve summarization across your data. So especially for those beginners today that declared that they had, an experience of 1 or 2 or 3, it is very important that you become familiar with these constructs and how to produce the optimal model that is going to deliver the correct visualizations in your reports. All right, we will return to this diagram with extra discussion later, but it leads us to another definition that this term star schema really relates to data warehouse design for relational data warehouses. And for data architects and BI developers, they're no doubt familiar with the concept. And yet the reason that Chris and I felt strongly that it belonged in this presentation was that to produce an optimal data model, you really need to adhere to the principles of star schema design. So in short, your tabular model will classify tables into one of 2 roles. They're either a fact table or a dimension table. Now, a dimension table describes the things that you're modeling. And in fact, they're really easy to identify when you listen to your requirements. I need to see sales by quarter. And where you hear the word by, it's a strong indicator that that is required for filtering or grouping and therefore should become a dimension. Facts represent the accumulation of your business activity. They could be sales transactions, they could be temperature readings, whatever you're measuring. Now, the reason it's called a star schema is, if you use your imagination, is that the center of the star is your fact table, and then you have the points of the star being your dimension table. Now, how does this relate to what we've just discussed about the filter, group, and summarize? Well, your dimension tables are there to achieve filtering and grouping, and your fact tables are there for summarization. Now, we could spend an entire presentation talking about just why this is so important, but what I will leave you with today is that the important concepts we think you should know about include, of course, dimension and fact table, but also granularity of data, dimensionality, surrogate key, and measure. Now, what I will do is just share a quick link with you. And I'll put this one in the chat window so you can browse in the meantime. But part of my engagement is that I do work as a vendor for Microsoft, and part of that is to produce guidance documentation alongside the CAT team, the Customer Advisory Team. So what I've just put into the window there is the article on star schema and the importance for Power BI. So while I don't have a lot of time to talk about it in this session, this is one of the first articles I wrote because it was just so important to producing, good quality data models. It provides you a brief overview of what star schema means, but where it becomes highly interesting for you guys as Power BI professionals is, why is this relevant? And what should I know about this mature modeling design approach so I can produce better results? So there you go. A complete article that will bring you up to speed with examples and help guide you to produce great Power BI results. Alrighty, so the next definition, still within the fundamentals, is that of a field. You see, the field isn't a model object. The field, as you're probably familiar with, appears in the fields pane. So in fact, what the fields pane is exposing to you are the resources of the data model that can be used to configure data visuals. All right, so we can see that columns, levels of hierarchies, and measures are collectively known as fields. And do you appreciate now that by perhaps drag dropping these fields into your visual wells, what you're doing is creating an analytic query? The placement of those fields determines how the grouping and summarization happens. Filtering is achieved by either a slice of visual or the filters pane. Last fundamental, and while this isn't a presentation on data flows, there is so much confusion about what a data flow is and what does it mean to a data set. Now, the fact is the data flow is a primary artifact in Power BI, but it represents a fragment of data that is intended to be used in a Power BI model. What's important to understand is that it cannot be queried directly. So imagine here then that we've got a Power BI service that's got a data flow and a report, and yet what people think can happen is that the report can just query the data flow. And in fact, they're wrong. What you would need to do is open up Power BI Desktop, and then using Power Query, you can connect to the data flow and potentially other sources of data, and you can use those connections to create your tabular model. You then publish that model back to the service, which results in a data set, and then what you're likely to do is configure a refresh to ensure that data, including data sourced from the data flow, is used in refreshes of the model data. And then the report can send those analytic queries to the data set. This is the topic of, or the grouping of fundamentals, and we're going to incrementally build up to more interesting and challenging scenarios for data sets. But before we move into deeper topics, we need to explore the fact that models can be either internal or external hosted. So internal hosted models literally are hosted within the Power BI service itself. For any model that you create in Power BI Desktop and then publish to the service, it is an internal model. Now, an external model is where the model resides outside of Power BI, and there are two places where this can happen: Azure Analysis Services for tabular models and SQL Server Analysis Services for both tabular and multidimensional. When it comes to external models, then, you will need to achieve what is known as a live connection to connect to that model. And let's see how this can happen. First of all, dataset A is connecting to Azure Analysis Services. The best case scenario for this, by the way, is that they reside within the same data region. And so therefore, there's little need to communicate, which could be expensive, between Power BI and a remote model hosted in a remote data region. In the case that you've got SQL Server Analysis Services, well, dataset B here can connect to it, whether it is physically on-prem or perhaps hosted in a virtual machine in the cloud. The requirement in either case will mean that you need the data gateway or the standard gateway to support secure communication between Power BI and your data models. Now, with a focus on the definition of what is live connection, often used interchangeably with direct query mode. Direct query and live connection are completely different concepts. Live connection means that Power BI is connecting to a model. And there are two scenarios for this. All right. First of all, when you're authoring a Power BI report in Power BI Desktop, what you can do is connect to a data set in the Power BI service. All right. In which case, what you're establishing is a live connection, and then you can build out a report. In this mode, Power BI Desktop is purely report authoring. There is no data modeling happening in Power BI Desktop. And when you've produced that beautiful, stunning visualization of data, you can publish it to the service, resulting in a report, and then we see the report simply queries the data set. I wouldn't regard that that's a live connection anymore. The report is just querying a local model. The second time we use the word live connection, or the term live connection, has already been explained to you, that you can have a data set that connects to an external hosted model. So we refer to this type of data set as a live connection data set. The report queries the live connection data set, but in turn, it redirects the queries to the external model. Model frameworks. Now we get really interesting. And I got to say that Microsoft's data modeling technologies are undoubtedly the most versatile in the world. And you're about to discover why. So before we dig deeper into frameworks, you need to be aware that tables in your model have a property known as the table storage mode, of which it can be set to three options: import, direct query, and dual. So coming back to this model diagram, what we'll see is that this property relates only to tables that have been sourced from Power Query. All right, this is not a property of a calculated table, because calculated tables always store imported data. All right, so you can set the storage mode for these types of tables. What it means for an import is that the data is literally imported into the model. The more data you import, the larger the model's size. Whereas direct query leaves the data in the source, and Power BI will query it using what's known as a pass-through. And then dual is an optimization that says, well, let Power BI decide what is more efficient. Maybe it will use imported data, or maybe it will pass through to the underlying data source. So with that understanding that we have this storage mode at table level, let's consider the most common scenario, which is an import model. By definition, an import model means that all tables are using import storage mode. It is the most frequently developed model. All right, so what we see here is that the model is developed, look at this growing star, as more data is imported, potentially from multiple sources, to create the import model. Now, in Power BI Desktop, when you connect to a data store, you might be presented with an option, as you see here for SQL Server, that says, what is the data connectivity mode? Is it import or direct query? And almost always it will default to import because it's the most likely setting. Why is it the most likely setting? Well, there are enormous benefits for importing data into your model. First of all, there is no restriction on the data source type. It enables data integration because we can import from multiple different sources, even different formats, and we can use the model with table relationships to integrate the data, or even Power Query to integrate data into tables. There's no restriction on the functionality of DAX or Power Query. It allows you to add new tables using DAX, known as calculated tables, and undoubtedly it delivers the highest performance. And the reason for this is that when data is imported, not only is it compressed to make it as small as possible, it is optimized and indexed for the fastest possible filter group summarize. Okay, it's all optimized about that analytic query. Now, wherever there are benefits, there are always limitations. Okay, so because we're importing data, then we need to give consideration to size. The more data that you import, the larger it becomes, and there are limits on resources. You see, these models must be hosted in memory in the Power BI service in order to be queried. So the restriction generally is that the model cannot exceed 1 GB in size, which is pretty large, when working in shared capacity. If you are looking to host larger models, then you can look to premium licensing to host larger models within premium workspaces, or potentially you could work with external models like Azure Analysis Services to host even larger models. The other consideration is that the data becomes stale and therefore requires periodic refresh to keep it current. And this could become a challenge for you, is that for volatile data, it may be unacceptable that the data is 24 hours old, okay? So you need to be aware of these limitations, but generally for standard business analytics, the size constraint or the latency of perhaps a day or perhaps several hours is acceptable to the business. The other thing to bear in mind is, especially for large models, that when you refresh a model or a table, it has to reload all of the data again. And for a fact table that is large with a lot of history, that can be very slow and it can place a burden on source systems. Now, there is a capability to do incremental refresh to work around that, but by default, incremental refresh is not enabled. All right, so import models, they provide the highest performance, the most flexibility for you as developers, but you've got to bear in mind that there are constraints with size and latency. Now, switching back to the guidance docs here at Power BI, the second article that I wrote for guidance was this article, how to reduce data when in creating import models. So I would encourage you to look at the 4 different techniques that you could consider to reduce the size of that import model. And by reducing the size of the import model, you're going to probably have faster querying and you're going to have faster refresh, and you can host more models within your capacity. All right, so it's always best to be as efficient as possible. You might argue today, by the way, that, oh, my data volumes are so small, why would it matter? But in 10 years' time, because your model design is so successful, it's still being used and it's accumulated a massive history. And it can be very, very difficult to refactor that model later on without breaking huge numbers of dependencies and reports. So I think, and Chris agrees, that you should always, always create import models with the highest efficiency possible. All right, now at the other end of the spectrum, when you've got a direct query model, what that says is that all of the tables in the model are using direct query storage mode, and they're connecting to the single database. All right, so you'll discover in a moment that it is possible to have multiple direct query sources. So by definition, a direct query model is a single source and all tables use direct query. So conceptually, what it looks like is this, that you create this star schema that connects to a single source. When report visuals query the data set, you'll see the pass-through happening here. Those queries are passing through to the underlying database. Right. In order to create a model like this in Power BI Desktop, you need to explicitly switch to the direct query connection mode. Now, for some connectors, you won't find this option. All right, and the reason for that is that only specific type of connectors support direct query mode. And in short, they are popular relational database products like SQL and Oracle, Teradata, and so on. All right, so by switching direct query mode, you're able to realize some interesting benefits. That you are no longer constrained by size of the model because it's never imported. Therefore, you can create models over excessively large data stores like data warehouses that could represent petabytes and petabytes of data. There is no need to do data refresh, so the concept of latency doesn't really apply to direct query, and it opens the potential for real-time analysis. Where you've got volatile systems, Power BI reports can be delivering the up-to-date results from those systems. Perhaps most interestingly is the scenario that is currently in preview, allowing direct query connections to data sets to achieve personalization or extensions of other data sets. And I'll come to that topic shortly. Huge benefits. In short, to summarize, direct query is appropriate when you have relational sources for large volumes and/or real-time results from those stores. Yet there are massive limitations you should be aware of. As already mentioned, not all data sources are supported. So certainly an Excel workbook or a CSV file does not support direct query, in short, because it doesn't have a query engine that can process queries. Your model queries in Power Query cannot be overly complex because those Power Query transformations must translate directly to something that the underlying database can query. So therefore, doing something like a pivot or an unpivot in Power Query, that works in import tables, but it won't work in direct query tables. Perhaps one of the biggest concerns with direct query is that it can be slow. And not just slow for the report user that is patiently waiting for the visuals to refresh or recalculate before their eyes, but it places a whole new workload on an operational system that could then slow other queries that database was designed to do. So a word of warning on direct query is that while you might have read permission to connect to that Oracle database, please ensure that the database owner that very graciously gave you those permissions is aware that you're going to place a whole new workload on the database by creating a direct query model and publishing and distributing reports to lots of users. All right, so the conversation really should happen that you should be asking for permission, and then collaboratively you should be talking about the likely queries that will be coming to the database, and then the database owner or administrator might optimize for those queries by using certain indexes or materialized views and so on. All right. Now, I certainly don't want to discourage you from using direct query because I think it's an awesome technology, but it's one that needs to be used with care if you're going to produce a successful and sustainable solution. Right. Generally speaking, the business analyst would use import models, and BI developers that produce, larger, more complex solutions are more likely to create direct query models. Now, the next term that becomes relevant is that of source group. And you may be familiar with source group because it has been previously referred to as data island, but Microsoft have gone and renamed it. What a source group means is that it's a collection of tables that use the same source. All right, so there are in fact two source groups. There is an import source group for any table that uses import storage mode. Of course, that includes calculated tables. And then there is a direct query source group for each direct query source that the model would use. So let's return to this example of an import model, because what we could do is make the model a little more interesting by adding a direct query source group so that some tables use import store and some tables use a direct query store to Azure SQL. All right, so there's the import source group and the direct query source group. What I've now defined for you is the composite model or composite if that's the way you choose to pronounce it. And by definition, a composite model is one that has more than one source group. Let's take a look at some examples. So here what you can see is a model diagram in Power BI Desktop. And so at a glance, it's easy enough to see that there are 5 tables, there are relationships between tables, and what stands out is that 3 of the tables have a blue line across the top. Now, that blue line indicates that they belong to a DirectQuery source group for the same source, right? So scenario, amount, and account belong to the same DirectQuery table. Now, where you don't see a line, or arguably the line is a white line across the top of the table, as you can see by hovering over the table, it is in import storage mode. The blue line represents DirectQuery storage mode for a specific data source. So in fact, in more complex models, you might see a green line for some tables, again indicating DirectQuery but for a different source. A quick side discussion about Power BI Desktop mode. So in the bottom right corner of Power BI Desktop, you might see an indicator in the status. All right, there are 4 different things that you might see here. You might see that it's a live connection, you might see nothing, you might see DirectQuery or mixed. What live connection tells you is that Power BI Desktop is in report authoring mode. It is not in a modeling mode. It is querying a remote model using live connection. So therefore, that model could be any framework. It could be import, it could be DirectQuery, it could be composite. When you see nothing, that tells you that you're in an import model, that all tables are using import storage mode, so there's only one source group. When you see DirectQuery, well, this is where it becomes a little unclear. From a framework perspective, it means you could be in a DirectQuery model or a composite. What Power BI Desktop is telling you is that every table is using DirectQuery storage mode, but not necessarily for the same source. And lastly, when you see mixed in Power BI Desktop, you're guaranteed that it is a composite model that has an import source group and has 1 or possibly more DirectQuery source groups. All right. It is my hope that Power BI Desktop team would drop with this conflicting definition and they would move to what the model frameworks actually represent. But it's just the way the product's evolved. I wouldn't get too hung up on this. It's certainly not something you're likely to find in the Power BI exam about, hey, what does mixed mode mean? But please understand from a model framework point of view, that's the important thing. What is the model that is being developed? Now, returning to this diagram then, let's do a bit of review. How many source groups? Well, the way I'd answer this question is by looking at the different colored lines. I've got white and blue, that tells me there are 2 source groups. Because I've got more import and I've got DirectQuery, then I know it's composite. And from a desktop mode, then I know it's mixed. But the interesting question is, how many data sources do I have here? And what might surprise you is that the answer is actually 1. You can't answer the question, how many data sources are there, just by looking at the data model diagram. All right, so the reason for this is that when you have an import table, you don't really know what the source was. For example, the date table could come from Excel and the journal table could come from another database. So the only way to answer the number of data sources would be to open up the Power Query editor and then look at the queries that are loaded to the model and then backtracking to see the sources. All right, but you then might say, well, why was there 1 and why are we using import and DirectQuery in the same model? And the answer is quite interesting. This is in fact a real model that I produced for a customer whereby every day at 6 a.m. the import tables load in all of the general ledger transactions. So they represent the actual transaction history. Now the blue tables are representing scenarios. What are our budgets and forecasts? And the company uses a write-back application when they fine-tune budget numbers and their forecasts. And what they want to do is write them back and then go to Power BI and instantly see how that tracks for their financial year. Now, they don't want to wait till 6 a.m. tomorrow to then see the result of the write-back that they've done. So the DirectQuery tables are providing a real-time ability to bring the write-back values into Power BI. Next term, a local model. So there are 2 terms I'm about to introduce, local and remote. And it's really a concept of relativity. From a point of view of Power BI, the local model is the one that's being queried. But as you're about to learn, we can chain models to create a relationship between them. All right. So a local model is either one being developed or queried, and it's a relative term used with direct query connections to Power BI datasets. And remote is just the other side of that. So let me clarify by telling you a bit of a story. So let's consider that I've got this dataset known as the core model. In fact, let me tell you that it's been developed by the BI group. It represents a direct query model over the warehouse, which is Azure Synapse Analytics. So it's considered to be the analytic source of truth, a direct query model connecting to Azure Synapse Analytics data warehouse. Now, as a business analyst, I've been asked to produce a new report, which is sales per capita. So the obvious thing to do is to use that single source of truth, open Power BI Desktop, create a live connection, and start to build out my report. But I have a problem, because when I look for a sales per capita calculation or a population column, the warehouse doesn't have it for me. Now, what I could do is I could walk on down to the data warehouse department. I could have a conversation with somebody. I could say, could you please add a column to the geography table that stores current population, because my manager wants a report for tomorrow's meeting. The fact is, it's very unlikely that that development would be agile enough to support a change by tomorrow morning. And it might well be argued that it's such an insignificant request in relation to what the data warehouse is designed to do that we're not going to consider it. Not all is lost, though. You see, because of a new in-preview capability, and this is remarkable, is that this business analyst, what I can do is I can edit the model. And what it does is it creates a local direct query model in Power BI Desktop. It basically copies table for table, column for column, and creates a new model with a direct query connection back to the data set. Now, this opens up enormous potential. I can personalize that new model, and by personalize it, I could choose to rename things and make it more what I want it to be. But perhaps much, much more interesting is the fact that I can extend the model. So look at this. I can go and find some credible source of data, perhaps Wikipedia. I can bring in some population data and create an import table. So now appreciate that my local model has a direct query source group and an import source group. So you're right, it's a composite model. I can create a relationship to then relate population into the direct query source group. I could create my calculation that divides sales by population. I can then complete the report design and then publish that back to the service, which results in a new data set and its report. Now let's refer to this as a specialized model. But what happens is that when the report queries the specialized model, some of the data is local. Like the population is imported into that model, but when necessary, Power BI can query the remote model to get the rest of the data. Now, do appreciate then that the remote model is querying direct query to Azure Synapse Analytics. So there's quite a chain of events going on here. So this is a new capability known as direct query over Power BI datasets in support of personalization or extending an existing data set. If you consider the reality if we didn't have this capability, to produce the sales per capita report, I would be required to create a whole new model from scratch, resulting in multiple versions of the truth, right? Importing sales data from the warehouse, importing my population, and things pretty quickly get out of control. The data's out of date, calculation logic isn't right, and this is what we're attempting to avoid. Duplication of data can be your enemy. All right, it brings us to another term, which is chaining. All right, so chaining is the concept that a data set chains to one other data set, and Microsoft will support a chain length up to 3. So this scenario is quite possible. Dataset C direct query to B, and dataset B direct query to A. What this means is that when report B queries dataset B, well, dataset C is irrelevant, but dataset B is local, and upstream you have dataset A being remote. And if we do have a report C that queries dataset C, well, dataset C is local and A and B are remote. This is an enormously powerful capability, all right, but it should be used with care because it's very easy to break these chains. For example, in dataset A, if the owner of the dataset renames a column, like a domino effect, it's going to break the other connections to datasets, and it will break reports. So you must use this technique wisely and carefully. Remember, Microsoft's Power BI allows you to look at data lineage view. If you are going to publish what you consider to be possible breaking changes, you should use this view to understand the dependencies and therefore ensure that dependencies won't be broken, or at least there's minimal downtime, and that we can be proactive in fixing things before users discover errors. So the last thing that I'll say is that in Power BI Desktop, there is a new property that you can say that my model will discourage direct query connections. And what discourage means is that Power BI Desktop will be refused a direct query connection to a model if this property is enabled. So there is a way of ensuring that chaining cannot happen from a model that you choose to create and publish. That completes the discussion on model frameworks, right? So it all comes down to table storage mode and import direct query. Now, dual storage mode comes up in discussion shortly when we consider how we might optimize our model designs. And by optimize, we're talking about improvement. And there's two things you're looking to improve. Clearly, query performance and refresh performance. So let's introduce the concept of a partition. And that is the case that in your model, all tables that are import have a partition, but potentially multiple partitions. And what that means is that you can potentially refresh at partition level. And this makes a lot of sense for large fact tables. That history hasn't changed, so why do we need to reload all of it again? So when you create partitions, it gives you a degree of control to refresh data when necessary. Okay, it does not apply to calculated tables. So here's an example in SQL Server Management Studio. In Object Explorer, I've connected to a workspace in Power BI. Now, this is possible because the workspace is using premium license. And therefore, the XMLA read-write endpoint allows a tool like Object Explorer to query. So here I've looked in a particular data set and I can see the tables, and I can also right-click, use the context menu to open up the partitions window. And it's here where you can create or manage or even refresh individual partitions. Of course, it can be automated through scripts as well, but this is the user experience. And here we can see 3 partitions, of which the 2021 internet sales has some data. Now, behind each partition is a Power Query expression, right? So you can see here that the filter is ensuring that for this partition, order date key must be within calendar year 2021. The next term for optimization is an interesting one because it's currently called a coming soon feature. And Microsoft announced back in April at the Business Applications Summit of a new capability coming to modeling known as the hybrid table. Now, what a hybrid table means is this. Recall that the storage mode for Power Query tables is stored at table level. But imagine if that storage mode becomes a partition level property. And therefore, you can have partitions across time where the older data that is really archived history is imported and left alone. And we can see that the most recent time period uses direct query storage. So what we can achieve here for an extremely large fact table is high performance history reporting and perhaps a little bit slower but real time current data reporting. All right, so stay tuned for what is coming. Hybrid tables allowing you to manage storage mode at partition level. Now to talk about that third storage mode of dual. Remember, import loads data, direct query storage passes through, and dual does both at the same time. Now, the reason you would configure dual storage is that you want Power BI to determine the most efficient query plan, which is always import querying if possible. So it's giving Power BI the potential to perhaps using an import cache of data instead of using direct query. So I returned to the model diagram that you saw earlier, but with a subtle difference. And that is that the date table is now in the direct query source group, and also that 3 tables have a striped line, indicating, as you'll see here in a tooltip, that it is using dual storage. So these 3 tables are both import and direct query at the same time. Now, I want you to notice something. In Star Schema Design, these are dimension tables, right? And they are supporting a fact table that is using direct query. So this is the standard use of it, where you've got a large fact table that is using direct query storage. There could be some optimizations by having the related dimensions in import storage mode as well. All right, so nothing has changed when we think about the number of source groups. There are still 2, there's still a composite and mixed mode, and there's still a single data source. It just happens that 3 of the tables are dual storage. So let's consider what this means then for certain Power BI visuals. Let's begin with the simplest visual, and that is that the fiscal slicer here is based on the date table. Now, because the date table is both import and direct query, the most efficient path will be use the import source group. And so slicers will benefit from import storage for dimension tables. Now, this visual is the current fiscal year expenses. That means we're filtering by the date table, we're grouping by the account table, and we're summarizing the journal table. All right, because the journal table is import, then the date and account tables will use import, and therefore the entire import source group will quickly achieve this query result. Now, the next visual is filtering by the forecast scenario, and therefore the summarization is taking place over scenario amount and the related dimension tables. Now, because they're in dual mode, then what Power BI is able to do is to use direct query mode for the dimensions in this instance. In fact, if you were to have some insight into the query that is sent to Power BI, sent to the underlying data source, it would look something similar to this. And you can see that in a single T-SQL, it's achieved joins between the dimension tables, it's applying a where clause across the dimension tables, it's grouping by a dimension table and summarizing the fact table. Power BI would determine that this is the quickest and most efficient way to retrieve the result for this visual. Now, the last one to consider is what happens for a visual that brings together actual and forecast. And the fact is that it will have to query all tables, and internally it will use an import query where it can, it'll use a direct query where it must, and then the formula engine will combine the results to ultimately return to the visual the complete query result. All right. So the whole concept about dual storage mode is allowing Power BI to determine the efficient retrieval when you have direct query fact tables in your model. Next optimization is to do with aggregations. So an aggregation is a table in your model that is designed to accelerate query performance. All right, so let's take a look at an example here that in this model diagram for the AdventureWorks company, you can see a fact table for internet sales, 2 dimensions for date and product, and yet there is this table that is the internet sales aggregation. And note that it's an import table, 2 columns. By date, what were the total sales amount? So this is a table designed to accelerate queries that just want to know total sales at day level. So let's consider that what we would do is create this table, import the data, manage aggregations, telling the model that this is what those columns represent. All right, it represents the date column of the order date table, and it represents the sum of internet sales from sales amount. Now, when Power BI understands what that table represents, it's able to redirect queries to the aggregation when it can. All right, so consider this. We've got a visual here that says current fiscal year sales by product color. Now, Power BI will determine that it has to use the product dimension. The aggregation does not have dimensionality of product, so it's going to have to use direct query in order to do this without aggregation. Yet a visual that says, just tell me by month what were the current sales, the aggregation is a perfect fit. So the import aggregation can be used. All right, so aggregations, when you manage them this way, they become completely hidden. They cannot be queried directly. They cannot be used in calculations. They cannot be used in row-level security. All right, so an aggregation table is there only to boost queries when appropriate. Now, interestingly, you can only create an aggregation over a direct query fact table. All right, so the internet sales table here is direct query. If it was an import table, this feature will not work. All right. But lastly, the aggregation table could be import storage mode or direct query storage mode. And if you have a direct query aggregation, it would imply that your data source has some pre-aggregated data, perhaps a materialized view that is going to boost query performance. On the topic of aggregations, a new feature coming, and I think in public preview now, is automatic aggregations that apply to premium workspaces. So instead of explicitly creating aggregation tables, Power BI can detect where aggregations might be useful and automatically create them for you. You don't need to do anything except enable the feature and determine the amount of aggregation that you would allow. The more aggregation, obviously, the more cost in terms of the storage and processing of the aggregation. So you'd want to fine tune that according to, experimentation. So stay tuned for automatic aggregations. And then lastly, there's a property known as query caching. And query caching allows Power BI to detect repeat queries and therefore cache results and reuse them. This is only a property available for premium datasets in premium workspaces. They are the first 4 groups of topics, and I'd ask perhaps Ken if you want to unmic and give me an idea of how we're doing for time and perhaps how many questions there are, which would guide me to how much more detail I could speak about.
We've only got a couple of questions in there, but I mean, honestly, timing-wise, you can take what you need. I mean, what do you figure? Are you another half hour? Are you another an hour? What's your?
Oh, I could talk to those cows come home. I could. Let me touch on perhaps some of the more important topics, and so let's say another 10 or 15 minutes at most. And what I don't cover would be available for you to read at your own pace in the downloadable PDF. So how about 10 to 15 minutes?
Perfect. Let's do it.
Thank you, Ken. All right. Well, the next group of terms relate to refresh. Remember, refresh applies to import tables. If you don't refresh them, then you're going to have very stale data. All right. So how does refresh actually happen? Well, it can happen at table level or partition level. It can be done scheduled or it can be done on demand. The report user could actually click the refresh now button. So it can be done in the Power BI service. It can be done programmatically. That's with the Power BI REST API or by using Power Automate, or you could use the XMLA read-write endpoint for premium, which perhaps Object Explorer is one example of a tool that you could use. Now, incremental refresh is partition level refreshing, but intelligent partition level refreshing. It is in fact a feature of Power BI where your data exhibits certain characteristics, like it has timestamps for when rows were created or modified, and you expose them in a very specific way in your model, and then you can enable incremental refresh, whereupon Power BI will create and manage the partitions for you and intelligently refresh what needs to be refreshed. So this can have a dramatic effect in keeping import tables up to date with minimal refresh operations. Scheduled cache refresh is a property on datasets. Now, what's interesting is, and if you were before me as an audience, I'd actually ask for a hand raised to say, how many of you use Power BI dashboards as opposed to Power BI reports? You see 2 different types of visualizations, whereas the dashboards are using tiles. But what's interesting to note is that the objective of a dashboard is to achieve high performance monitoring of data and to guarantee that those tiles express the most recent data that Power BI is aware of. Now, what happens is that when a refresh operation completes, any dependent dashboard tiles are instantly updated so that their caches are up to date. But there's a challenge, because what if you're using a live connection to an external hosted model, or it's a direct query? The Power BI doesn't have an understanding of whether the external data has changed. So what you can do in this instance is configure a property known as the scheduled cache refresh that allows you to configure anywhere between 15 minutes and 1 week of the frequency that these caches for live connections and direct queries should just update the dashboard caches. All right. Gateway comes into the conversation next, because the gateway, while there are 2 flavors, you've got the personal gateway, but more commonly we talk about the standard gateway that is used for on-premises. So the gateway serves 2 purposes. First of all, for caching of data. So when we refresh import tables and they are on-premises sources of data, a gateway will be required. But of course, the gateway is also required for live connections to SQL Server Analysis Services or for direct query sources that you have on premises, like an Oracle or DB2 database. Gateways themselves have data sources, so the gateway admin can define data sources in terms of a data source type, the connection details, including credentials that the gateway will use to connect to those sources. Permissions can be granted to these data sources as well, and that would enable dataset owners to use the data sources when they publish their datasets. Next topic is security. So the terms related to security, the first one is dataset owner, that every dataset has a single owner. It begins as the author of the data model that published it to a workspace, but ownership can be taken over by others. And it is a requirement that if you want to configure things like the data source credentials or configure data refresh scheduling, and you're not the owner of the data set, then you are required to take ownership of it. There can only be one data set owner at a time. Be warned that if you do take ownership of someone's data set, perhaps because they're enjoying a holiday and on annual leave, that the credentials must be re-entered. So do make sure before you do so that you have those credentials on hand to update how the data set will connect to external stores. Now, when it comes to permissions for data sets, there are 3 permissions you need to be aware of. They are read, build, and reshare. So essentially, read is required if you're going to consume the data in the data set. You know, by perhaps opening a report that uses the data set, you must have read permission. Build is required if you're going to create new content. So creating a new report, analyzing in Excel, and the other one is exporting detailed data from a visual will require build permissions. And reshare is where you're granting permission for others to share to others. Now, you may want centralized control and you will delegate privileges, or you might be happy that others spread those permissions themselves. Now, it's unusual that you actually assign permissions directly on a data set. They're either inherited through your workspace role membership, right? So when the data set belongs in a workspace, when members are added to the workspace, they can be given admin, they can be given member, contributor, or viewer permissions. If you are a member of the workspace and you're an admin, member, or contributor, you will automatically have build permission. If you're a viewer, you will only have read permission. But you can go into a data set and you can provide explicit permissions beyond the roles of the workspace. The other way that you get permission on a data set is via an app. That if you are granted permission to an app, you will automatically have read permission on the data sets that the app uses. And optionally, if the app publisher has approved build permission, you might have build permission also to create new content based on the data sets that the app uses. Gateway permissions as well. So gateway admins install and set up. So they have permissions to create, manage gateways, and to assign data sources to dataset owners. Now, data permissions comes in next, so let's return to the tabular model diagram because we can continue building it out with another object called a role. And a role is a collection of one or more rules that are in effect DAX expressions that filter the model. Now, the whole concept here is that you can have the same data set used by multiple report users, but they will see different data based on who they are and according to the rules. So this is a way of ensuring that a subset of the data is only visible to specific audiences. Now, there are 2 types of rules. The static rule says that it's a fixed filter, like country region is Australia. And I could add a second rule for UK. Now, sorry, a second role. Now, what that would mean is when you publish this data set, you would map Azure Active Directory objects like users and security groups to these roles. And that is the way that they will see a subset of the data. Now, what's interesting is we have the concept of a dynamic rule that is using the DAX function of username or user principal name. And what that means is that providing that you store the username in the data model itself, perhaps there's a column in the employee table, and you store the user principal name, which is like the email address, then we can apply filters to it. And via relationship and filter propagation, you can ensure that salespeople only ever see the sales that they have made themselves. All right, that's achieved with a dynamic role using the username function. Then lastly, for security, and this is pretty advanced, there is what's known as object level security. This is the ability in a tabular model to hide tables or columns, and by hide them, they are not even recognized. That if you do not belong to a role that has those permissions, then in fact, a visual that attempts to query a column that is removed will get an error, as if that column does not exist. So this is reserved for typically highly sensitive data, perhaps like salaries of employees. Right, it is not common to use this. Power BI Desktop doesn't surface it. And it would only be supported in Power BI by models that are premium. Governance, let's rattle through some important governance topics. Oh, by the way, on this, let me switch to Power BI documentation, because very recently, due to Melissa Coates putting in a great deal of effort, we've just gone ahead and published what's known as the Power BI Adoption Roadmap, which is an awesome series of 11 articles guiding you through how to deliver success within your organization, and especially as your organization evolves with your data culture through maturity levels, which Melissa goes to great extents to define here. So please do check out, if you're not aware of this, do check out this recent addition to guidance documentation supporting you in delivering success for Power BI within your organization. So on the topic of governance, which is so much around what that roadmap talks about, there are awesome amount of usage metrics that allow you to understand usage across practically everything that's going on within the Power BI service. Endorsement is an important topic for data sets because you can endorse data sets to make them promoted or certified. What a promoted data set means is that its owner is telling you that the data is suitable for sharing. So you can see here that the per capita sales data set that I own, I've promoted it, telling my colleagues that I'm encouraging you to use this data. Now, a certified data set is a higher level concept because it declares that it meets quality standards and is to be used within the organization as authoritative. Now, in order to certify a data set, you must be granted explicit permission by a tenant administrator, either directly or via a group membership, that you are allowed to certify data sets. So we can see in this example, the finance cube that Chris Webb owns has been certified, and therefore telling people that this is really the source of truth when it comes to financial reporting. Data lineage, as I've mentioned earlier, is a way to visualize relationships between artifacts in Power BI. What's interesting about this diagram is that we get to see that this US sale analysis data set actually has two sources. And notice that the second source here is analysis services. This is in fact the DirectQuery connection, the chaining to another data set. All right, so if I was to update this connection here, I would want to make sure that the US sale analysis is not broken through dependency. Sensitivity labels, and I heard Yana mention some new features coming in September. So this allows you to classify risky data and to ensure that it isn't used inappropriately. So the cool thing about sensitivity labels is that they will follow the data all the way from Azure Synapse all the way through to Office. That some data might be viewable but cannot be exported, for example. Data catalog is the concept that you've got a place to discover data assets within the organization and a way to gain access to that. So Microsoft are working with their new release of Azure Purview, and all we'll say at this stage is that Power BI datasets are a first-class object that are understood, and when cataloged in Purview, will open up the discoverability of data within the organization. Natural language is really easy to talk about because it's all about that feature of Q&A, that natural language ability, like in a search engine on the web, to go and ask a question and have a response come back as a data visual. And then you can fine tune that question to arrive at what you want. Now, this could be great because it says to you, you don't have to author lots and lots and lots of reports to anticipate every possible question your users have. What I often do today is I have a page at the end of my report that's called Q&A. And this is where any ad hoc questions that the other pages don't cover can be addressed. Now, from a terminology point of view, is that the synonym allows you in Power BI Desktop to extend tables, columns, hierarchies, levels, and measures with alternative words that might be used by your users. Linguistic schema is a much more detailed concept of creating synonyms and parts of speech, like it might be a common phrase to talk about expensive products. And you can define within your model that expensive product means a product that has a price of more than $500. That's natural language. I'm going to leave real-time analytics out, but in fairness, I will share a link to you with a recorded presentation between me and Miguel Martinez, who was the PM for real-time, that goes through 50 minutes of detail on real-time, except to say, and what I will do here is just talk about the fact that there are these different types of data sets. So you're now familiar with an internal hosted model, an external hosted model. You see, when you look at a data set in the hub, you don't know what type of data set it is. The icon doesn't tell you anything. The core set operations could be what we call a push data set, which programmatically allows inserting data into a table of a model to generate real-time responses. Or it could be a streaming data set, which is another type of data set for dashboard real-time results. Or it could be like the device telemetry, which is hybrid, which is in fact both push and streaming at the same time. So do note there's another discussion to have about data sets for specific real-time scenarios. But having said that, a newer feature in Pages of your reports called automatic page refresh can do an automatic refresh simulating real time. And this is all driven by the fact that you're using DirectQuery storage. So you could say that on this page, it refreshes automatically every 1 minute, and then without any user interaction, because it's a DirectQuery model, the visuals will just refresh automatically on a 60-second cycle. All right, so real time can also be delivered through DirectQuery models and the automatic page refresh feature. All right, so for more detail on that webinar, feel free to click on this link when you download the presentation. So with what's left, there are a couple of few straggling topics to complete what are over 50 terms related to data sets. So parameter comes up because in Power Query, you can parameterize your queries to introduce variability, often to allow filtering to happen as an afterthought, or that connections between environments, let's just say dev, test, and prod, might change. Now, when you put queries in Power Query and then they're published as a data set, then the values of those parameters can be updated without the need to reopen Power BI Desktop and republish. All right, so common uses, connection strings, and filters. Large dataset storage format, that when you have a premium workspace, there's the option to switch to what is known as large dataset format that is optimized for larger datasets, so only applies to premium. This one is perhaps the cutest, maybe insignificant, but I think is fun. The fact is that you can upload an image file to become the icon for your dataset. So by clicking upload, we can upload an image file, and then when you're in the datasets hub, you might see it as a promoted dataset using its icon, perhaps in Teams when people are discovering datasets. So the image can personalize, but make it easy and quick to identify a particular dataset. Lastly, handful of properties. There's a 500 character description you can write for a dataset that's going to be helpful for discovery and cataloging. Making it discoverable, so when you endorse a dataset, when you make it discoverable, it will show up in the datasets hub even if users don't have build permission to it. They won't be able to create new content and it will be ghosted out, but it will at least be visible and they could request access. And that's the other property you've got. You can determine how access could be requested. Either an email is sent to the dataset owner, or you could provide your own text description on how they should reach out and request that access. Lastly, as already discovered, there is a property in Power BI Desktop that will discourage the chaining of your data model. That is pretty much the glossary of terms. So now might be a good time, Ken, if there are any questions that I could address.
Sure. All right. Let me see what we've got here. So some of these go back quite a ways in the presentation, but that's okay. I think we can still handle some of these anyway. There is a question here. In your opinion, why do we still have to use Power BI Desktop to create data sets? Why doesn't this Power BI service allow the creation of data sets directly so far? And are you aware of any plans for that?
So the real-time data sets can be created in the service. So there's an answer there, but it's probably not what you're asking for. So Microsoft have made attempts at this, so I won't speak on their behalf, so I'll be careful there. They did create a tabular designer for Azure analysis services, but the fact is it's a very, very complex thing to set up in a web browser. So let's just say for now, the tool is Power BI Desktop, but you will notice the interesting addition to the ribbon of external tools, allowing Tabular Editor to also allow you to configure models. So I don't have a really good answer for you. But the answer is today you cannot create an internal hosted model that is import or direct query in the service itself. The only tool is Power BI Desktop. The only other option, of course, is Visual Studio and creating models that are published to either SQL Server or Azure Analysis Services. All right, but the answer is Power BI Desktop is the tool, and I cannot tell you what Microsoft's thinking is in that space.
Fair enough. Now, I think this one actually was answered or asked fairly early, and I think that you actually answered it in quite some detail. Is there any benefit to using the dual method over the other explicit methods for connecting to data sets? I mean, you went through that in quite some detail, so we'll skip on that one. Unless, David, if there's anything else that you wanted more clarification on, feel free to shoot that into the chat now. Another question, will the specialized data set automatically inherit the same access list from the core data set, or will it require a new access list?
So for the chaining to work, the report user must have read permission down the chain. So I'm not sure if the inheritance necessarily works, but it would need to be in place. So I'm not sure inheritance is the right word, but ultimately what needs to be in place is read permission down the chain.
All right. You've got a comment in here that sounds like somebody could listen to you read the phone book, so that's always kind of cool.
What was that comment? I missed it.
I'm paraphrasing, but they're expressing their great pleasure at the fact that they love listening to you talk about theory, which is a kind of an odd comment. So next time we'll get you to come back and read the phone book and see if we get the same kind of comments as well.
I'm looking forward to
it. So next one here, how would you maintain a data set if incremental refresh caused a data set to exceed the maximum size limits?
Well, okay, when it exceeds maximum size, then you get errors and the refresh fails. So incremental refresh isn't about avoiding a large model size. Although, okay, it gets quite technical because when refresh is happening, there's actually a shadowing that is happening. So the refresh actually happens in the background and then it's sort of merged back. So at some point in time, ignoring incremental refresh, if you're doing a refresh of a model, your capacity requires potentially double the size of what the model is because it keeps the model live and active and it's refreshing a new one in the background. Okay, so what incremental refresh can do is it can mean you can still have a large model, but because it's only requiring a smaller shadow in the background as it's refreshing the smaller the partitions themselves, you'll get away with not requiring as much space in your workspace, right? So for example, 1 terabyte is the largest model size is what we've said, but that's not quite true because if you want to refresh it, the shared capacity will only allow 1 gigabyte, right? So you're sort of like, the reality is it might be half a gigabyte in order to refresh it, or you would use XMLA read endpoint and remove the model and then refresh it from scratch. I'm going too technical, but if you look into docs and you look at the premium capacity and how it's designed to work with topics like eviction and refresh and such forth, they'll help you answer the question. But to the question that incremental refresh, is it going to solve the problem of the size issue? Maybe, but probably not, is my answer for now.
There you go. Perfect. That's the end of the questions in the chat. Henry, I see you have your hand up and you're also off mute, so I'm assuming you have a question you want to ask?
Yes, hi. Thank you, Peter and Ken. For some reason, my chat button is not there, so I can't put in things in the chat. My question is relating to back to the fundamentals. Power BI works with tabular data, tabular model. And my question is, there is another class of database called graph databases, like Tiger Graph and so on. Mm-hmm. The question is, can Power BI work with graph databases and vice versa, or will the two never should meet?
So the answer I'll give you is like Power Query, as Ken will tell you, is an extraordinary technology that connects to a wide variety of connectors, including the Graph API if you want with, for example, Azure AD. The thing about tabular modeling is you need to conform to a table structure. So if you've got graph data, then you're going to have to make it tabular. All right. So using Power Query to connect to a graph source and to produce a fixed column table is what Power BI would require. So it's possible, but you're going to have to do these sort of workarounds. If you look at an example like a parent-child relationship is sort of one of those challenges that's sort of graph related, is that it does that by having a self-referencing column within a table. Okay. My employee ID and my boss's employee ID. So the answer is you can work with pretty much any source of data these days with Power BI, but you must bring it into a table structure.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
I believe that's it for the questions, Peter. I've got one more question just about a recording. And yes, folks, as normal, I will get a recording posted up on my YouTube channel the next 24 to 48 hours. I always post a link to that in the meetup group, so you will get a notification about that as well. So no, it won't be available in the chat, just because I don't like to rely on Teams for that in case people can't access the chat, which apparently has already happened tonight. It's a shame that Teams isn't as stable as Power BI and Excel, isn't it, Peter? Anyhow, yes, we will get a recording up. Just give me a little patience because I do need to actually download it. So, Amy, what we'll do is I'll actually post the link directly into the meetup, and that way you'll get a notification, and that'll take you directly to the channel there. So.
So let me wrap up with the conclusion, and I'll let you finish up, Ken. So I've just posted a whole series of links into the chat window, and I guess the conclusion is this, as in, first of all, there is another way to watch this video, as in Chris Webb and I presented a 50-minute webinar for Microsoft. So you might want to see this if you want to hear Chris's voice as well. When it comes to the detail about what I've talked about, let's be honest, it's just been a glossary of terms in this presentation, helping you understand conceptually what a data set is and how all of these different, features and capabilities fit together. To go into that level of detail that's going to help you fully understand and assess the suitability for your project, please check out Power BI documentation, and certainly the guidance documentation that I referred to you earlier, where there is an enormous amount, as I'm showing you here, of guidance documentation, especially when it comes to data modeling and what that means for data sets. So relationship discussions, direct query model guidance, composite model guidance, row level security guidance, it's all there. And then I can just wrap up with the briefest of marketing messages. I know I'm in Melbourne, Australia, but if you're looking for Power BI consulting or mentoring, please do check out what my website has on offer for training. I train at a classroom level, not at the individual level, but very happy to talk to you about what your virtual training requirements would be. But the last slide I'll leave off on and hand it back to Ken is if you'd like to download this presentation as a PDF that has all of those terms and examples included, use the QR code here or the tiny URL or the URL that I've just pasted in the chat window. That's pretty much it from me. So I will thank you very much for your time and attendance and your interest in this extraordinary topic of Power BI datasets. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you, Peter. And that gave me enough time to actually go and dig up the link to my YouTube channel and post it into the chat. Somehow I know I've customized it to get a better link, and I can never find it when I'm looking for it. So at least that will hopefully get you there. All right. Well, on that note, since there doesn't appear to be any more questions, Peter, thanks again for coming and doing this. Always love your presentations. Learn a ton here. You know what I just realized too is that I've actually had my video off all day. So hey man, it's good to actually see you. I don't have quite the beard going on that you do, but that's actually inspired me too. Yeah, just a little. I keep trimming it.
Love the monkey in the background though. You know that.
Yeah, he's working hard. Sometimes he's got the best things to say out of this office. So there you go. At any rate, I'm going to shut things down for tonight, folks. As mentioned, I will get the recording up in the next 24 to 48 hours. Thank you very much for coming, everyone. And don't forget that we got a couple more presentations coming up over the next month. The RSVP windows are open for those, so we hope to see you there. So thanks again, and thanks again, of course, to Yana for doing a great What's New in Power BI to kick this off. I believe she's gone for the day, but we always appreciate having her come in and pitch in with that stuff as well. So on that note, we're signing off. Thanks very much for coming, folks. We'll see you next time.